to this first episode of Tales from Obscure Places. My name is Kevin Neville. I will be your host on this first episode, which I've entitled The Coalminer's Daughter. So, I just began a 2-week solo road trip, and I'm very excited about it. I'm going to be traveling south. I'm going to be meeting with amazing men and women of God, children's pastors, youth pastors. I'm going to be ending up in Atlanta at the Orange Conference. And there's going to be stories along the way. God doing amazing things. And I kind of like the stories that take place, not the ones you expect to happen, but the ones that happen in obscure places. So this first story began yesterday, before I even left town. It was Sunday morning. I was beginning my trip. I was heading towards the first part of my trip, which is Delaware. And I thought before I left, I had a sort of early start. I couldn't check into the hotel till later in the afternoon. I was going to get there too early, so I thought, why don't I go Canandaigua and grab some breakfast first on my way out of town? And so I drove just down the road, Canandaigua. I parked my car, and there was a place that I wanted to go to, right on the main strip. And so I parked, I walked up the street. Now, I got to tell you, some of this story is confessing my craziness of being in my own head. And I think I'm going to be honest, I think some of the best stories happen because of the craziness that happens with me. But I walked into Patty's place, and I noticed how full it was. You see, there was a couple that was behind me, and I was there by myself. And I saw one table, and it was a booth. And this is the conversations that happen in my head. Say, Kevin, you're gonna ask for a table, and they're going to have to give you the booth because that's the only thing available. But the couple behind you, there's two of them, and they're going to have to wait, and it doesn't look like anybody's leaving soon. And they're going to look at you because you singly took that one booth. It's full, and that's sort of selfish of you. And so my thought was like, I don't want to do this. I can't be awkward and just let them have the seat. So this is the craziness that happens in my head. So I said, I'm just going to leave and go someplace else. So without question, I just nodded at them, slipped out the door, and walked down the street. And they were kind of looking at, no idea what happened. But in my mind, it was being gracious and kind to them. But I was like, well, where am I going to go now? So I said, oh, wait, there's another place that I know of, another family diner right down the road. I'm going to walk there. And so I did that. I walked down the road. I walked into this other diner, and same thing, except for there was one table free, but one person in front of me. So maybe that person's gonna eat at the bar. They could eat at the what do you call it? The where they put all the single people. And the counter. I couldn't remember the word counter. But then they would give me that table for two, and it'd be perfect to have a nice quiet breakfast. I'll work in my planner, I'll get on the road, and I'll travel to Delaware. But they asked for the table, which only left the counter. Now, you gotta understand something about me. I'm an introvert. I don't like counters. You have to sit there, squeeze between strangers, maybe forced to talk, forced to ask them to pass the creamer and the ketchup. And otherwise you just have to kind of stare at your own food with people squeezed in beside you. And it's an introvert's nightmare. But I thought, well, maybe I should just leave this place too. Well, that's just crazy. Just sit down and suck it up. So they sat me at the counter, squeezed in between this big football player type guy and this little old lady on the other side, both of them there by themselves. And then I saw the guy sit down at the table that could have been mine if I had been there 3 minutes earlier. For some reason, he looked around, he stood up, and he walked out. I thought, this is a guy that's crazier than me, apparently. And so I was about to call the waitress over and say, hey, can I sit at that table? But I thought, what if that's rude to the football player and the old lady right here? You know, it's like, so I said, you know what? I'm just going to suck it up. Going to sit here, stare at my planner, order my food, stare at my food, stand up, pay, and leave when I'm finished eating. And the waitress came over to me, started taking me. She looked at me. She looked at the guy beside me. She looked at the old lady. She said, man, are you lucky? I said, me? They just sat you between my two favorite people. And then she walked away. That was all she said. I was like, great. Now I feel like I have to have a conversation. You know, but I looked at the football player. He smiled, went back to his food. Looked at the old lady, smiled, went back to her food. And I said, phew, dodged that bullet. But she didn't introduce us. I didn't know who they were. Why were they her favorite people? Was it her son and her mother? Was it grandma and her paper boy? The football champion? I don't know who these people were. But somehow my counter situation got awkward. And I looked up and they had, you know how they have signs sometimes in these diners, and they had a sign that read this: the counter, where strangers become friends and friends become family. I looked at the football player. I looked at the old lady. And I said, nah, that's not going to happen. Not going to become lifelong friends with football man over here. Not going to become lifelong friends with grandma over here. I'm just going to eat my food. And sure enough, as soon as I ordered my coffee, football lad stood up, said, have a great day to the waitress, that he was one of his favorites, and walked away. So I said, okay, good. Starting to get better now. I could spread out to this side, and I noticed that the old lady, maybe in her late 70s, early 80s was my guess, and she had finished her food, and she was finishing her coffee. So I said, she's going to be leaving too. Things were clearing out, and I could have my breakfast in peace. Yeah, I'm a really good pastor here, talking about my introvertedness. But as soon as they poured my coffee, she said, you know what? I'm not ready to go home. And the waitress said, then you don't have to. And she goes, I want another cup of coffee. She said, no, but you've had your fill. And the other waiter was like, give her another one. Give her another one. I guess they were taking care of her. So they poured her another cup of coffee all the way to the brim. And I was like, oh no. But you know what? She's keeping to herself. And so I said, and then the worst thing in the world happened to me. She took a sip of her coffee. She looked over at me. And she started talking to me. And this is what she said. She said, talking about how the waitress refused to give her another cup of coffee, like it was something to do with her health, or maybe she had reached her full. And the other one was like, I think one more is okay. And she referred to that. She goes, they're looking out to me. These people are really my family. Because I'm looking up at that sign. Strangers become friends, and friends become family. And I was just like, well, I wasn't going to be rude. I was like, oh yeah? She goes, yeah. They take care of me. I had hip surgery a few months ago. And guess who showed up at my door as soon as I got home? It was them. These waiters and waitresses, a family that owns this restaurant, showed up and cared for me. She said, these people have really become my family because I have nobody else here. Okay, well, that got me kind of curious. So I said, really? Did you grow up in this area? She goes, no. I moved here from Indiana. And you have no family here? I said, well, that's a bit of a long story. And then she looks at me and she goes, said something I very much wasn't expecting her to say. She said, well, you know, I'm a recovering alcoholic. Okay, that seems like sort of an odd thing to start a conversation with a total stranger. I'm a recovering alcoholic. But she was just open and honest about it. I said, okay. And she goes, yeah. So I moved here a number of years ago. My sons were here. Both my sons were here. So they talked me into moving to Canandaigua from Indiana. And I moved here. And as soon as I moved here, one of my sons died. And you could tell she was heartbroken over that. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. And she looked at me. She said, thank you. Thank you for being sorry. I said, well, what about the other son? Well, his family had moved over to Wyoming, so he decided to go with them. And so he moved away too. So then I was left here by myself. You know, at this point, you feel like you've gone on a little journey with her. You know, you found out she's a recovering alcoholic. That must have been hard. She was alone, but these people became her family. Her son died. Her other son moved away and here she was in Canandaigua all by herself and alone. No husband, no family. And suddenly I realized I'm invested in this story. I need to know what happened. My introversion went away. My breakfast came. I ate it. But now I had a new focus. She introduced herself. She said, my name's Kathy. And Kathy began to tell me her story. Over the next hour, honest, we sat there drinking coffee. They kept giving her a little bit more. Said, a little bit more, Kathy. You could have a little bit more. And for the next hour, she told me the story of how she was a coal miner's daughter that found some of the real meaning in life through some hard times. So the story began. Telling about her younger days, I said, well, so you're from Indiana? She goes, no, we moved to Indiana when I was a teenager, but before that, we lived in Kentucky. And my whole family, cousins and uncles and grandparents, they all lived in this one town, and this town came about because they opened a new coal mine there. And so my whole family, the men, were coal miners, and the rest of the family worked for the company. And so I grew up the daughter and granddaughter of coal miners in Kentucky. And she began to talk about how life was like. She goes, you know, looking back, we were dirt poor. And she looked at me and said, but you know what? I never knew that. I grew up poor, but we never knew we were poor. Not until much later in life. And she said, we had 8 of us crammed into a 2-room house. There was no bathroom. We had an outhouse outside and no plumbing for years. I remember she told us we moved to a house and it had running water in a bathtub. And it was like heaven. And she began to tell how she was a tomboy growing up, of course. And story after story, she would be talking about how she would be playing in the neighborhood. The old story that you come home when the street lights came on, that you became friends with the entire town. And she began to just recite for the next hour just all these stories about growing up. She would talk about how her dad would let her work in the workshop where she was, and her grandparents would just have her come over and they would bake food for her, and she told me about what they made and just what they instilled in her and the life she had and how hard it was to work in the coal mine. She talked about how the coal mine shut down and the whole family, the whole town just was out of work and they didn't know where to go. It led to a move to Indiana. And she would talk about how, she would go to the candy store and the guy that worked at the grocery store or the convenience store would give her credit, and her dad came in and she would pay her 25 cents that she owed, and the dad would be like, oh, what are you doing? She goes, I'm paying my bill. And she found out that the guy would she would have a tab open for candy. She would come in, she would give him candy, the guy would keep track of it, and he said, I'm teaching her the value of money. And at 6-year-old, she was building this learning model relationship with the people of the town. And the more she talked about it, the more I realized this was a perfect example of somebody who grew up poor, but didn't know it because she had family. And how great it was. Life got hard after that. But for that brief shining moment, she didn't have running water. She was crammed in a room with 4 other kids. But she had everything she needed. She had family. And, and so she kind of told the story backwards. She told the story about how life got hard, that she had to face her alcoholism. She had to face the loss of her child, which is what led to that, and the heartbreak that you could see. And then she went back, as further back she went, the more she talked about family, the happier she got. And then finally at the end, it was time for me to go. I was on my 3rd or 4th cup of coffee. They were ready to cut me off too. I looked at the watch. It had been, like I said, well over an hour. I said, Kathy, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for bringing out of my shell. I was just going to sit here and ignore everybody and eat my breakfast. But you made this beginning part of this trip an adventure. And I looked up at the sign, the counter, where strangers become friends. And friends become family. I put out my hand to shake her hand. And Kathy said, where I'm from, we don't shake hands. We shake bodies. I said, what? So she stood up and gave me a big bear hug. Kathy, thank you for listening, for sharing, for talking. And she read, as she told her story, and as she wrapped it up, and we said our goodbyes, I began to think of that one verse from Psalm 68, verse 6, that says, God puts the lonely in families. Now, Kathy wasn't necessarily a person of faith, but I looked around at the waitress that said, you're sitting by my favorite person. They were strangers until she sat at the counter and they became family. Kathy was put in a family. And I began thinking, for these 2 weeks when I travel alone, I get lonely. I feel my family's back at home and I know they love me, but I feel like there's nobody in the world that loves me. It's not true, but that's how it feels sometimes on the road. And I pray, Lord, I'm my own worst enemy. I sit at the counters and I try to ignore people. You give me opportunity and I put it back in your lap. And then I complain that I don't have family and I feel lonely. But I think God showed me that all I have to do sometimes is listen. I love stories. And God puts the lonely in families. He does it. He puts the lonely in families. Sometimes all you have to do, though, is listen when you're at the counter and the stranger starts talking. This has been Tales from Obscure Places, Episode 1, The Coalminer's Daughter. All right, guys, what you just heard is something new I want to try. Again, I call it Tales from Obscure Places because I realize that often in life, in the margins, not when I have it planned, but when I definitely don't have it planned, great and strange and bizarre and wonderful things happen. And I have stories. And I know I'm on the road for 2 weeks, and so I thought, I'm going to keep my ears open and eyes open for for different tales from obscure places. So maybe there'll be 2 or 3 episodes over the next few weeks. Maybe there'll be 8. Maybe there'll just be this one. But there's other times when I have other stories to tell. So maybe when I pull out my equipment, I'll start going through some of the other tales from obscure places over the years. Some of them will be bizarre. Some of them will have beautiful life messages. Some of them will have no purpose at all, except for they entertain and freak me out. So this is the first of the episodes, Tale from Obscure Places. And when things happen, I'm going to get them down here because I know when you love a story, sometimes you just need a place to share it. So stay tuned for the next Tales from Obscure Places. I'm your host, Kevin Neville. See you down the road.